Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is our senior senator, Tom Udall. Thank you for joining us.
Lorene, always wonderful to join you, and you do a wonderful program here and keep everybody so well informed in New Mexico.
Well, I want to keep them well informed about, we are here to celebrate the effort, 3-year effort that you had to get this very important reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act, or the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. After 3 years, it passed both houses with you nipping at their heels, and it was signed by the president. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
How does it feel?
It's been a long time coming.
Yes.
But yes, to tell you how I feel, as you know, Lorene, I'm an outdoorsman. I like to climb mountains. And when you get on the top of a mountain, you get and it's good weather, you get these wonderful views, 360 degrees. And the experience on getting on top after a lot of hard work is elation. And I'm right next to that. I mean, that's something that's very exciting for me. It's not quite to the mountaintop because I'm not surrounded by the great outdoors, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close, but it's a wonderful feeling.
So anyone who reads the news knows that this is not a happy time in Washington, D.C.,
No.
and the discord and the toxic partisanship and the sniping and backbiting, and it's just like nothing gets done. And you, with your co-sponsor, David Vitter, Republican from Louisiana, and this other team of lawmakers you got with you, got this bill through both houses and signed by the president on June 22nd of this year. I want to just address I watched the president's speech, and it was so careful. He went through all of our efforts, the bipartisan efforts environmentally, for 40 years. He talked about, he was a college kid going to Occidental, going out to jog. It was a smog alert. This is in the 70s. And he didn't know what that was. And we had acid rain, we had toxic air. And back then, 40 years ago, it took a bipartisan effort to attempt to fix it. And industry and lawmakers worked together.
That's right.
Walk us through what's happened since then and why this was so important, what you've done.
There are a couple of it's very, very good questions there. The first question is this piece of legislation is in line with all of the things that my father and his generation did in the 60s and 70s to protect the environment. So everything you're talking about, Lorene, clean air, clean water, toxics, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Wilderness Act. There's so many bedrock environmental laws that were put in place. And this one didn't ever work very well. It just never worked very well. They were able to ban 5 substances, but when they tried to ban asbestos, a court stepped in and put down an impossible standard. It wasn't a very good standard for health, and so EPA 25 years ago just gave up. They just didn't do anything on toxic chemicals. And when I saw that, working with Frank Lautenberg, who's the law is named after, I said, we've got to do something about this. And I was just determined. I found a great Republican in David Vitter to work with me as a partner and get this done. He always stood with me. David Vitter and I don't agree on a lot, but we wanted to get this bill done. And so what happened is we stuck to it. We built the coalition, and we kept pulling we worked both sides and pulling Democrats and Republicans together. And we even had some of the senior people in the Congress fighting us and trying to say things that weren't true about us. But we stuck in there, and we got it done.
Well, you did a great job reconciling the opposites in terms of the parties, but there were other opposites you had to reconcile, which is the industry, chemical industry, the environmentalists, and all of these things. So this was a masterful weaving together things. And I watched this for years. You would come back with it changed. People would bring up some very important element, and you'd put it in the bill.
Yeah.
There were elements, states' rights, will to get into all this animal testing, all these things, and you would modify the bill anytime someone would bring something that would improve it to protect the health and the safety of Americans, and especially the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, the ill, and poor communities, as the president mentioned. There was a concentration of people who are really deleteriously affected by this.
Well, the thing, Lorene, I learned from my father is if you, and I also learned this studying the major environmental laws, if you're going to pass a law like this, you have to have everybody at the table, all the stakeholders, whether it's industry, the public health groups, the environmental groups, the Environmental Protection Agency would give us technical advice and tell us what would work and what wouldn't work. And so by having everyone at the table, you get a good product. You get a good, strong environmental law, which that's what we have. What we do there now, which you're referring to, and no pun intended, it's a toxic environment. People won't stay at the table. If they get at the table, they throw rocks at each other. It is not conducive to good legislating. But in this case, we had everybody at the table. We talked through the issues, and just as you said, there were times when issues were proposed and it got rocky and people started to walk away, and we said, this is too important. You have to stay there. And so that's one of the lessons, is on a major piece of legislation, keep everybody there, work with your chairman, and try to build coalitions. And we were for the first year of this work, it took me 3 years, we were in the majority. Democrats, we didn't get it done in the majority. We actually got it done in the 2 years of us being in the minority. And so that was pretty significant.
Even the president in his signing statement said, even in the current polarized environment of Washington, D.C., things can work. If we can get this bill done, perhaps we can make our politics less toxic as well.
Lorene, now that is exactly a model of what I hope this is that people will see, get committed, find a group across the aisle. You've got to have Republicans and Democrats to do this. Work together. You're going to take arrows. You're going to have rocks thrown at you, but stick in there with it. And that's the persistence and the doggedness, or whatever you want to call it, that it takes. And that's what we did. And I'm elated, as I say, about the result. We now need to make sure that the EPA implements this. We need to make sure that there aren't people from the outside that try to tear it apart. It's going to take them a little bit of time to get geared up and get things in place, but we can all support them and work well with the Environmental Protection Agency that's going to implement this law.
Well, if anything needed reform, I'm afraid it's that agency. In 40 years, they had only blocked 5 out of 85,000 chemicals. That doesn't even show up. That's not any sort of result. And I think when it was in 76, they had stopped 4 chemicals out of 62,000, but now we are awash in chemicals. They've done tests of mother's milk, and there's 212 chemicals in mother's milk. Yeah. And all of us, from flame retardant sofas, and even the receipts that we handle have BHA or BHP in it. I mean, everything, we are just in a chemical soup. Mm-hmm. And it's affecting us, our health overall.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about, you had a lot of very fierce criticism. And what I couldn't understand, there's an old saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. To have them accelerate their testing by 100-fold, how can that be bad?
That isn't bad. And one of the points on the last little discussion you had that I think is very important is most people need to understand that the things they buy at the hardware store or the grocery store have not been tested for safety. And people think that's true. Well, today, we've now stood up an agency that's going to go out and do that testing. But as you say, we have 85,000 chemicals in existence, and we live in kind of a toxic soup of chemicals. And so we need to be conscious of that. We need to read our products. We need to support companies that are manufacturing products in a sustainable way and trying to do everything they can to make sure that they're producing a product which is not going to harm children or pregnant women or the elderly or chemical workers who are exposed to a lot of these kinds of chemicals. So this is a long-term effort that needs support and needs to continue over time. And people should understand you don't just pass a law. It's everybody monitor the law and decide to make it better over time depending on what happens.
So this law provides for actual funding for the EPA to do their job. And you worked very closely with the EPA about this because I'm sure they've always wanted to do this job.
Yeah, they have. And there's some in this agency, there's some very good career people and technical people, toxicologists, chemists, people that really know this stuff. And one of the things they told us, they needed additional resources. And what we did in this bill, we put $25 million extra dollars every year. So when they really get geared up and rolling and have that extra money, they'll be able to do a lot more. On top of that, if one company, it could be a small business, just says, I have a chemical and I'm really eager to get my product onto the market, they can get in line, and if they pay 100% of the cost, they can accelerate that particular chemical. So that's going to get additional resources into the mix too. So you have the base budget they have, an additional $25 million, and then if industry is really strong about getting a chemical evaluated and get an EPA stamp of approval, they can pay 100%. So that's going to add a lot of additional resources to this effort.
So I did have two questions. One was the funding, which you've explained, and the other one is teeth and enforcement. So talk to me about the enforcement side of this.
Well, the first thing you have to have, and you talked about this is the fascinating thing, you have to have a strong public health standard. And the standard has to basically say, make sure that there's not any unreasonable risk out there, and in particular, focus and emphasize on vulnerable populations. And so what are we talking about, vulnerable populations? Well, we're talking about infants, children, pregnant women, the elderly, and chemical workers. So the standard that will be applied to chemicals will take into consideration these vulnerable populations. This is what the public health groups and environmental groups have always wanted. And so we're going to see that in the new testing that's going to move down the road now.
I need to go back even further now. We're speaking today with Senator Tom Udall, and I'm so grateful that you joined us because I'm still thrilled that we have this now in place. But if you look across the Atlantic at Europe has a whole other structure in place. For the Europeans, no chemical gets on the market until it's proved safe. But in this country, it's always been you can put anything out until somebody proves that it's not safe. Well, we can't go back, to before the beginning. But do you think we can move now when these chemical companies have a new chemical they want to put out? That's what the teeth part of this is. That we will test it first.
Laureen, many of the first of all, no new chemicals can now come on the market unless there's been a safety review. And so that safety review is going to be in place. Then on top of that, the Environmental Protection Agency can start looking at the most dangerous of the 85,000 chemicals that are out there. So that's absolutely crucial too. But people have told me, the experts I deal with, they say this is better than Europe's law. They believe it's stronger, it's better, it will work for the average citizen in terms of their ability to have products which won't impact their health, and it'll also make sure that you'll have an industry that'll be able to innovate and grow jobs here in the United States. So you find that right balance between all of it. But I think you're going to see a much more aggressive EPA because we've given them the teeth, we've given them the regimen they need, and we've given them the public health standard that's there in place.
I think people think, oh, these chemicals, it's long, multi-syllabic words of chemical names, but even right now, asbestos, a known carcinogen, is not ruled unsafe. Formaldehyde,
Yes.
we all know this is dangerous stuff, and yet, under the old EPA, it was never limited. So now we're going to, and then there are all those obscure multi-syllabic words, chemicals, but these basic ones that are part of our everyday life, those, I hope they start with, are they going to start with the most common?
Yes, and they'll start with the most dangerous, where I hope first of all, you have new chemicals coming in that'll get a review, but then of the ones that are out there, they're going to start with the most dangerous. I would hope that one of the group of chemicals they start with is asbestos, and you've talked about flame retardants, you've talked about chemicals in the plastics. There are a lot of chemicals. The interesting story is that asbestos is the one that brought the law down, because what happened in 1989, the EPA moved to ban asbestos. It went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals stopped the ban and put in a public health standard that didn't ever work after that for the agency. And so the agency said, well, we can't meet this standard. They
It's
have gone
too onerous.
so
It's
far.
too-
And what they did is they called it a least burdensome standard on business. And what that meant is the EPA said, we can't do it.
Yeah.
And so for 25 years, the law didn't work at all. But now we've stood up this strong EPA on chemicals. We've got the tough cop on the beat that's going to protect our families and our children. We've got a good public health standard out there, and that's what is going to be good as we're moving into the future. But I would encourage everybody, don't just rely on a law. As I said, every day you have an impact in the consumer marketplace. You can buy products that you have investigated, where the companies are trying to do everything they can to be sustainable, where they're trying to manufacture safe products, and where they have seals of approval from various organizations that you trust. And so those kinds of things exist today, and having a strong consumer movement really makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to try to do everything I can to keep building the consumer movement around the safety of chemicals and designing the legislation and revisiting the legislation so that we keep it up to date, because that's one of the keys to this.
You mentioned asbestos. Asbestos kills, is it 10,000 people a year, and it's a known carcinogen? And
And if you add it up around the world, it's a lot worse. Many uses of asbestos are now banned. Just because the companies knew how bad it was. And so, for example, it was in building materials, and people that were building houses and consumer buildings and commercial buildings and all sorts of structures out there said, well, we don't want asbestos. Everybody knows asbestos is carcinogenic. We don't want it. And so the market for it went way down. But people are being injured when they renovate places where there's asbestos in the building materials. And I think there's a very strong case for the EPA to pick this as one of the most dangerous chemicals and act upon it.
Mm-hmm. You come to this through your father, of course, a man I just really loved and respected. Your whole name is Thomas Stewart Udall.
That's right.
Your dad was Stewart Udall, the cabinet secretary for the Department of the Interior under Kennedy and Johnson. And what a magical time. He's responsible in large part for the Clean Air, Water Quality Act, Clean Water Restoration Act, Wilderness Act, Endangered Species Preservation Act, Land and Water Conservation Fund, National Trail System Act, Scenic and Wild Rivers Act. It's like this golden era where, so much was done to protect and preserve our natural bounty.
Yeah.
And do you see a movement with the passage of this bill through your long work? Do you see an awareness, an openness among lawmakers now to say, wait a minute, we've got some rivers that you light them, they catch on fire. Let's get back, to basics.
I think I see that. I see that in terms of it being a model where people say, look, this can be done. I'm going to put in a little extra effort and make sure that it gets done. And you're absolutely right about my dad. I mean, the period that I grew up in the 60s, was when he was working with Rachel Carson on chemicals. She came out with her book, Silent Spring. It alerted the world to chemicals and how they were impacting us. One particular chemical destroying bird eggs, and so that you could wipe out and make extinct a specific bird. And so Rachel Carson was a part of my life growing up, knowing with my dad how they both advocated for a different kind of look in terms of chemicals and a different way of having the chemicals and things we invent and innovate, how they fit into the natural world. And so that's part of why I think I just became outraged when I saw that this law wasn't working. This was one of the same laws that my father built the foundations for it, and then it was passed in 1976 after he was out of the cabinet, but he certainly was supportive of that effort. And then, as we've noted here, it never worked. It just never worked.
You got a lot of criticism. One of the criticisms was the length of time. Don't they have 7 years to get up to speed? And another criticism was that you were working too closely with the chemical industry, and yet, in any of this transformative lawmaking, like you said, you have to have everybody at the table. And not everybody's happy with the result. That's when you know you've succeeded.
Yeah.
And there was another issue with states' rights and preemption. I know that California has Proposition 65, but we in New Mexico, we can't afford to do this kind of testing. And there's many other small states like us that need the feds, the federal EPA, to come in and help us take it.
Okay, you've raised a couple of things here. First of all, the length of time. We all want immediately the marketplace to be safe, but we need to make sure that we don't tie the hands of EPA in such a way that through lawsuits or whatever kinds of tactics that they get shut down again. And so they're not going to take all the 7 years on chemicals that they look at, but they're going to take the time they need in order to make sure the public's safe. And so we carve that time back significantly, but I think we left them the room they need to really do a good job. The other thing that you mentioned is the chemical industry. Well, of course they were at the table, but we also had the lead environmental agencies at the table. Some walked away, but others stayed there all the way through. I'd really compliment the Environmental Defense Fund and the National Wildlife Federation. They stayed at the table. They worked with us all the way through. Chemical industry didn't have anything to do with writing the bill, which was what some of our opponents accused us of. What they did is they stayed and made suggestions, and everybody there listened to them. We took some of what they said because we wanted to be able to grow jobs in America rather than sending jobs overseas. But what we have is a very strong health-based standard. The other thing you raised, Proposition 65 in California, we grandfathered it in. So Californians can do everything with that proposition that they passed. And then the thing people really need to know about New Mexico, and this is one of the things that moved me a lot, New Mexico has no protection. We don't have the wealth of California to set up a toxic agency to review chemicals, to hire toxicologists and chemists and all these people. And so ever since the court threw out, Lorene, the law in 1991, we haven't had any protection. And most of the states in the United States are in the same place as New Mexico. They haven't invested the resources. They've trusted that the EPA has been doing the job. which it hasn't. And so that's where we are. So I'm happy to answer the questions that are out there, because we handle them well, and we always move the bill. Just like you said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When we saw criticisms, we changed the bill. We moved the bill left all the way through the legislative process. We improved upon it. We made it better in terms of public health, better in terms of the environment. And in the end, the industry folks said, we can live with this. And that's what, they weren't necessarily happy, but they're able to live with it. And so we got a good, very good product. Not perfect, but we can keep working on it.
Well, the enemy of the good in this case is we're almost out of time. So just say a few, and this is so important. I'm glad that we went into it in depth. Talk about the atmosphere in the Senate, maybe the Supreme Court nomination, and what your future plans are in 1 minute.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to tell everybody is how important it is to vote. And I'm not telling anybody how to vote, but you highlighted one of the things that people should be concerned about. Here we have a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and the Congress, specifically the Republican Senate, has said, the last year of the president, you shouldn't fill a vacancy. You should leave it up to the voters. Well, here we have a court that now can't do its job, and it's been rejecting cases that have come before it. It's allowing the circuit courts to decide those cases. So that's just one great example of why people should get motivated and get out to vote. And as I said, working on this consumer movement on the safety of chemicals, that's one of the things I'm going to be continuing on. And everybody knows I'm always fighting for New Mexico and making sure that we do the very best job for New Mexico there in the United States Senate.
Do you have other political ambitions, or are you just happy to rest on a little bit?
I love being in the Senate. I'm just 2 years into a 6-year term, and so I'm very happy where I am.
Well, I'm very happy where you are, too. The Frank Lautenberg bill that you passed, this is a major accomplishment. And I really want to thank you on behalf of not just New Mexicans, but Americans, to make our lives for our families and our children safer. So I really want to honor you for that.
Thank you, Lorene. Always great to be with you.
Our guest today is Senator Tom Udall, and I hope you'll come back. We'll do all the other questions another time, but we had to celebrate this.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.